Hello, and welcome back to Bored to Sleep. Tonight, we're going to talk about Christmas. Not the exciting version of Christmas, not the loud one, not the version that involves batteries, complicated instructions, or trying to remember where you put something last year. This is the quiet Christmas, the slow Christmas, the historically confusing Christmas. Because Christmas, despite how familiar it feels, is actually a very strange collection of habits, traditions, and borrowed ideas that slowly drifted together over hundreds of years. It wasn't planned, it wasn't designed, and it definitely wasn't created all at once. It's more like a long historical nap, interrupted occasionally by candles, paperwork, and mild disagreements. And that's what we'll be exploring tonight. You don't need to learn anything. You don't need to remember names or dates. You don't need to stay awake. This is history designed to gently pass the time while your thoughts slowly wander away. So wherever you are, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your shoulders relax. Let your breathing slow down just a little. Christmas feels ancient, but most of what we associate with it is actually surprisingly recent. And even the older parts were rarely as meaningful as we like to imagine. Many traditions began not because they were sacred or special, but because they were practical, convenient, or simply already happening. People, historically, are very good at keeping traditions that already exist. They are less good at inventing brand new ones. Long before Christmas meant anything religious at all, winter was simply a problem that needed to be managed. The days grew shorter. The nights grew longer. Food became harder to find. Work slowed down. And people were left with large stretches of cold darkness and very little to do except think. Thinking, as it turns out, is not always helpful in winter. So human societies across the world developed ways to mark this time of year, not necessarily to celebrate it, but to survive it. They lit fires. They gathered together. They ate stored food. They told stories. They created rituals that gave structure to days that might otherwise blur together. These were not joyful occasions in the modern sense. They were practical ones. They reminded people that the darkness was temporary, that the sun would return, that life would continue. Much of what we now associate with Christmas comes from these older, quieter responses to winter itself. Lights existed because darkness was overwhelming. Feasts existed because food would spoil if it wasn't eaten. Green plants were brought indoors because they were rare and reassuring. None of it was symbolic at first. It was just comforting. Later, when religions spread and changed, these habits didn't disappear. They were simply reinterpreted. New meanings were placed gently on top of old behaviors, like fresh snow settling over familiar ground. This process was slow, sometimes accidental, sometimes intentional, and often, nobody involved realized they were creating something that would last for centuries. There was no moment when someone stood up and announced that Christmas had officially begun. No one unveiled a complete set of rules or decorations. Instead, customs accumulated quietly. A candle here, a song there, a shared meal that slowly became expected. Christmas grew the way most traditions do, gradually, unevenly, and with plenty of regional variation. Some people celebrated it enthusiastically. Others ignored it entirely. Some opposed it. Some tried to ban it. But it lingered. Over time, Christmas became less about surviving winter and more about remembering how winter used to feel. It became nostalgic before nostalgia had a name. A reminder of warmth, togetherness, and continuity in a season that once felt uncertain. And yet, for all its emotional weight, Christmas remains surprisingly mundane at its core. It's built from agricultural schedules, religious compromises, political decisions, and social expectations. It's a holiday created by habit more than intention. And that's what makes it perfect for a boring history. Over the next while, we'll gently wander through how winter festivals existed before Christmas, how Christianity adopted and adapted them, how celebrations changed through the Middle Ages, how Christmas was once considered suspicious, and how it eventually became the cozy, sentimental season we recognize today. There will be no surprises, no dramatic twists, no loud conclusions, just a slow unfolding of how people, across centuries, did what they usually do. They kept what worked. They borrowed what felt familiar. And they repeated it until it felt inevitable. If at any point you drift off, that's completely fine. The history will continue without you. So take another slow breath. Let your thoughts soften around the edges. And when you're ready, we'll begin by going back to a time before Christmas existed at all, when winter was simply winter and the darkness came without decoration. Long before Christmas meant anything at all, winter arrived every year in much the same way it does now. Slowly at first, and then all at once. The days shortened. The sun appeared briefly, if at all. The air grew colder, and the ground stopped producing food. For most of human history, this was not inconvenient. It was dangerous. There were no electric lights to soften the darkness. No supermarkets stocked with food flown in from somewhere warmer. No central heating quietly doing its work in the background. Winter was something that had to be endured carefully, with planning, cooperation, and a certain amount of hope. People noticed very early on that winter followed patterns. The sun did not disappear forever. After reaching its lowest point in the sky, it slowly began to return. Days became a little longer. Light crept back in, almost imperceptibly at first. This moment, when the sun stopped retreating and began to return, became important. Not because it was joyful, but because it was reassuring. It meant that the worst had passed, or at least that it would pass eventually. This was the winter solstice. Long before anyone thought of it as a holiday, it was simply a marker, a point in time that could be observed, tracked, and quietly acknowledged. Stone monuments were aligned to it. Calendars were adjusted around it. Fires were lit a little longer than usual. It was not celebrated with excitement. It was recognized with relief. Winter forced people indoors. Work slowed. Fields rested. Animals were slaughtered because feeding them through the cold months was often impossible. This meant there was suddenly more food available than usual, but only for a short time. So people ate. They ate together because eating together was efficient and comforting. Food was shared. Fires were shared. Stories were shared. Not because anyone was celebrating, but because it made the long nights feel shorter. Green plants, which were rare in winter, took on a quiet importance. Evergreen branches were brought inside not for decoration, but as proof that life still existed somewhere, that not everything had died back completely. Light mattered too. Candles, oil lamps, and fires became central features of winter gatherings. They pushed back the darkness just enough to make it tolerable. Light was practical, but it also became symbolic simply by being necessary. None of this required belief. None of it required explanation. It was simply how humans responded to a season that demanded patience. Different cultures did this in different ways, but the patterns were remarkably similar. There were shared meals. There were moments of rest. There were rituals that didn't mean very much individually, but meant something collectively. These were not holidays in the modern sense. There were no fixed traditions, no universal rules, no shared stories that everyone agreed on. Each community developed its own habits based on climate, resources, and memory. Some groups stayed awake through long nights, talking and watching fires. Others marked the solstice quietly, barely acknowledging it aloud. Some turned it into an excuse for controlled disorder, while others emphasized calm and restraint. What mattered was that winter was not ignored. Ignoring winter made it feel endless. By giving winter structure, people gave themselves a sense of control. Even if nothing actually changed, it felt like something had been acknowledged, and that was often enough. As generations passed, these habits became familiar. Familiar habits become traditions without anyone deciding that they should. Children grow up seeing adults repeat the same behaviors, and eventually repeat them themselves. Over time, winter gatherings became expected. People looked forward to them not because they were exciting, but because they were known. Predictability was comforting when so much else felt uncertain. These early winter customs were not about joy. They were about reassurance. They said, quietly, that this season had been survived before and could be survived again. When new religions and belief systems later appeared, they did not arrive in empty spaces. They arrived in communities that already had rhythms, habits, and seasonal expectations. Winter was already full, so when meanings changed, the behaviors often stayed the same. People continued to gather. They continued to light candles. They continued to bring green plants inside. They continued to eat together. Only the stories layered on top of these actions shifted. This is important to remember because it explains why Christmas feels older than it is. Many of its most recognizable features come not from theology, but from human responses to winter that predate organized religion entirely. When people later explain these customs, they often assigned spiritual meanings to actions that had originally been practical. Light became symbolic. Evergreens became hopeful. Feasts became celebratory. But at the beginning, they were simply useful. The winter solstice did not promise salvation. It promised daylight. And for people living without modern comforts, that was enough. As centuries passed, empires rose and fell, belief systems spread, and calendars were rewritten. But winter remained winter. Cold, dark, predictable in its arrival. And the human response to it remained remarkably consistent. Before Christmas ever existed, the season already had habits waiting for it. All it needed was a new name, a new story, and enough time for people to forget how ordinary it had once been. And that forgetting happened slowly, one winter at a time. In the next part, we'll drift gently into the world of ancient festivals that filled this season with structure and indulgence, where rules softened briefly, food was abundant for a moment, and winter was met with something that looked a little more like celebration, even if it was still mostly about endurance. For now, there's nothing you need to hold on to. The cold can stay outside, the fire can burn quietly, and the night can take as long as it wants. As winter gatherings became more familiar, some societies began to formalize them. What had once been quiet acknowledgments of darkness slowly turned into scheduled events. Not because anyone wanted more excitement, but because structure was comforting. In the ancient world, calendars mattered. Knowing when to plant, when to harvest, and when to rest could mean the difference between stability and hunger. Winter, being less useful for farming, became a natural place for festivals to settle. One of the most well-known winter celebrations belonged to the Romans. They called it Saturnalia. Saturnalia began as a religious observance dedicated to Saturn, a god associated with agriculture and time. Over the years, it grew into something much larger and much louder than its original purpose. It took place in mid-December, close to the winter solstice, and lasted several days. During that time, many of the usual social rules were temporarily relaxed. Work slowed or stopped entirely. Courts closed. Schools closed. Business was postponed. People were expected to participate, whether they felt particularly festive or not. There was eating. There was drinking. There was gift-giving, usually small and symbolic. Candles were exchanged, not as decoration, but as practical objects that made the darkness easier to live with. One of the most notable aspects of Saturnalia was the idea of role reversal. Slaves were allowed to eat with their masters. In some households, slaves were even served by the people who normally commanded them. This was not equality. It was performance. Everyone understood that the old order would return as soon as the festival ended. But for a short time, the appearance of loosened hierarchy made the season feel different. The chaos was controlled. The disorder had boundaries. And that made it safe. Saturnalia did not exist to challenge authority. It existed to release pressure. Letting people step briefly outside their roles made it easier to step back into them afterward. In a way, it was a social reset. Loud, indulgent, and very temporary. Elsewhere in Europe, winter was marked differently, but with familiar themes. In northern regions, Norse communities observed what would later be called Yule. This was not originally a single day, but a season that stretched across the darkest part of the year. Yule involved feasting, drinking, and honoring gods associated with fertility, protection, and the return of light. Fires were important. Large logs were burned slowly, providing heat and light over many days. Evergreen plants featured heavily, not because they were beautiful, but because they were unusual. In a landscape dominated by bare branches and frozen ground, green needles stood out. They became reminders that life continued quietly, even in the cold. Animals were sacrificed, meals were shared, and stories were told. Much of this took place indoors, where people could remain together for long periods of time. The emphasis was not on joy, but on endurance and continuity. Other cultures had their own versions of winter festivals. In some places, they were solemn. In others, they were indulgent. Some focused on ancestors. Others focused on gods or natural forces. What they all shared was timing. Midwinter was when people had time. Fields were inactive. Travel was limited. Long nights encouraged stillness and reflection, or at least conversation. Winter festivals filled the silence. As the Roman Empire expanded, these traditions overlapped. Local customs blended with imperial ones. New festivals absorbed older practices. Names changed, but behaviors remained familiar. One particularly important Roman celebration took place on December 25th. It honored Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. This festival celebrated the sun's strength and its inevitable return. The symbolism was straightforward. The sun appeared weakest in winter, but it was not defeated. Light would return. Darkness would retreat. Candles, fires, and brightness all played a role. It was not subtle. These festivals were not private. They were public. Streets filled. Homes opened. Food was shared widely. The season was marked visibly and collectively. And because these celebrations were so embedded in daily life, they became difficult to remove. When belief systems changed, people did not easily give up the rhythms that had shaped their year. Even when new religions discouraged older practices, those practices often survived in altered forms. They were too useful to abandon. They provided rest in a demanding year. They created social cohesion. They gave people something to look forward to. So when Christianity began to spread through the Roman world, it encountered a population that already expected something to happen in winter. Something involving light, food, and gathering. This created a quiet problem. Early Christianity did not include a winter celebration. It did not emphasize birthdays. It did not require a festival in December, but the people did, and people are very persistent about their habits. At first, Christianity coexisted alongside these festivals. Some Christians participated, some avoided them, some criticized them. Over time, however, it became clear that winter celebrations were not going away. They would either remain separate or they would be reinterpreted. That decision did not happen quickly. It was not the result of a single conversation or decree. It unfolded gradually, across regions and centuries. Small adjustments were made. New meanings were suggested. Familiar dates were reused. And slowly, without most people noticing, the season began to change. What had once been a collection of pagan festivals, solstice observances, and agricultural pauses began to take on a new identity. Not because everything old was erased, but because it was gently redirected. The candles stayed. The feast stayed. The gathering stayed. Only the story was rewritten. In the next part, we'll move into a time when Christianity existed without Christmas at all, and explore how a religion that didn't celebrate births eventually found itself adopting one of the most elaborate birthdays in history. For now, you don't need to remember Saturn, or Sol, or Yule. They've already done their work. They've already left their traces. You can let them fade quietly into the background, like fires burning low at the edge of a long winter night. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, there was no Christmas. There was no annual celebration of a birth, no fixed winter festival, and no expectation that December should feel different from any other cold month. This was not an oversight. It was intentional. Early Christians focused almost entirely on the death and resurrection of Jesus. These events were considered central, meaningful, and necessary to discuss. Birth, by comparison, was ordinary. Everyone was born. Not everyone was resurrected. In the ancient world, birthdays were often associated with rulers, emperors, and gods. Celebrating one's own birth was sometimes viewed as prideful, even suspicious. For many early Christians, it felt unnecessary, or worse, pagan, so they didn't do it. The earliest Christian calendars revolved around fasting, remembrance, and preparation. Easter mattered. Lent mattered. Weekly worship mattered. A birthday did not. For several generations, no one asked when Jesus was born. It wasn't considered important. The Gospels do not record a date. They provide only vague details, and even those differ slightly between accounts. There are shepherds in one story, wise men in another. There is a census, but no month. There is a star, but no season. None of it was meant to be precise. This lack of detail did not trouble early Christians. They were not trying to reconstruct a historical timeline. They were focused on meaning, not scheduling. So for a long time, Christianity existed quite comfortably without Christmas. Meanwhile, outside the church, winter festivals continued. Roman society still paused in December. Candles were still lit. Food was still shared. People still expected warmth and gathering during the darkest weeks of the year. As Christianity spread, this contrast became more noticeable. New converts did not immediately abandon their old customs. They brought them along quietly. A shared meal here, a candle there, a habit that seemed harmless enough. Church leaders noticed. At first, some resisted. Pagan festivals were viewed with suspicion. Excess, role reversals, and indulgence did not align neatly with Christian values. There were sermons condemning drunkenness and disorder. There were warnings about participating in inappropriate celebrations. But warnings did not erase expectations. People still wanted something to happen in winter. Over time, Christian thinkers began to discuss the idea of commemorating Jesus' birth, not as a replacement for older festivals, at least not openly, but as an additional observance. Different regions proposed different dates. Some suggested spring. Others suggested autumn. A few suggested January. There was no agreement because there was no evidence. Eventually, attention settled on late December. December had advantages. It was already a time of rest. People were already gathering. Work was already slowed. A new religious observance would not disrupt agricultural cycles or existing rhythms. It would fit. December 25th, in particular, stood out. It coincided closely with Roman celebrations of the sun's return. Light overcoming darkness was a theme people already understood. Christian symbolism adapted easily. Jesus was described as light. Darkness became metaphorical. The language aligned neatly with the season. This did not happen through a single announcement. There was no universal decree declaring December 25th as the official birthday. Different communities adopted it at different times. By the 4th century, however, December 25th had become widely accepted in the Western Christian world, not because it was proven, but because it was convenient. This choice did not erase older festivals. It reframed them. Candles were no longer just practical. They represented spiritual light. Feasts became expressions of gratitude. Winter gatherings took on religious significance. To most people living through this transition, the change probably felt subtle. The season still involved food, warmth, and community. The stories told during that time shifted, but the actions remained familiar. Christianity did not remove winter festivals. It absorbed them. This strategy worked because it did not ask people to abandon comfort. It allowed continuity. It respected the human need for ritual during a difficult season. As a result, Christmas began its slow emergence, not as a grand celebration, but as a quiet addition to an already full calendar. At first, it was modest. There were church services. There were prayers. There was reflection. No decorations. No gift exchanges. No elaborate traditions. It was simply a day marked differently from the others. Over time, it grew. As Christianity became more established, Christmas gained importance. Sermons were written. Hymns were composed. The story of the birth was expanded and retold. Still, it remained restrained compared to what we recognize today. There was no single way to observe it. Some communities emphasized fasting before the day. Others emphasized feasting after. Some treated it as a single moment. Others stretched it into a season. What mattered was that Christmas now existed. It had a date. It had a place in the calendar. And it had room to evolve. The older winter customs did not disappear. They lingered beneath the surface, shaping how Christmas felt rather than how it was explained. Light mattered. Greenery mattered. Gathering mattered. These things had always mattered in winter. Christmas simply gave them a new story. As centuries passed, fewer people remembered the transition. December 25th began to feel inevitable, as though it had always been there. And that is often how traditions succeed. They become familiar enough that their origins fade. In the next part, we'll drift forward into the medieval world, where Christmas became louder, longer, and far more social, shaped by feasts, obligations, and a very specific understanding of hierarchy. For now, you can let the dates blur. You don't need to remember the century. Just the feeling of a season slowly taking on a new name, one quiet adjustment at a time. As the medieval world took shape, Christmas settled into its place on the calendar and began to change in character. It became less theological and more social, less about doctrine and more about how people spent their time together. In medieval Europe, life followed a strict rhythm. Most people worked according to daylight and season. There was little flexibility. Tasks were repetitive. Roles were fixed. Time off was rare. So when Christmas arrived, it was noticeable. It was not a single day. It was a season. In many places, Christmas stretched from late December through early January, sometimes lasting 12 days or more. This period allowed for rest, travel, and gathering at a time when agricultural work was minimal. The church played a central role. Attendance at services was expected. Special masses were held. The story of the birth was retold repeatedly, not because it was new, but because repetition created familiarity. But outside the church, Christmas looked very different. Feasting became central. Animals that could not be fed through winter were slaughtered. Meat was abundant for a short time. Bread was baked in large quantities. Ale and wine were consumed generously. These meals were not casual. They were public statements of stability and generosity. For nobles and landowners, hosting a Christmas feast demonstrated wealth and authority. For peasants, attending one provided rare access to excess. Hospitality was expected. Doors were opened. Travelers were welcomed. Neighbors gathered. Refusing food or drink could be seen as rude or even suspicious. The idea was not enjoyment, exactly. It was obligation. Christmas created a temporary shift in behavior. Normal work paused. Social interactions expanded. People who rarely met shared space. Music and performance became part of the season. Songs were sung. Stories were told. In some places, plays reenacted religious scenes. In others, entertainment drifted into comedy and satire. This blending of sacred and secular made Christmas lively, but also unpredictable. One recurring feature of medieval Christmas was controlled misrule. For a short time, hierarchy softened. Lower status individuals were sometimes given symbolic authority. Games were played that inverted roles. Like Saturnalia before it, this disorder was carefully limited. It began and ended on schedule. Everyone understood that it was temporary. These moments of inversion did not threaten the social structure. They reinforced it. Allowing release made long-term obedience easier. Not everyone approved. Church leaders frequently complained about excess. There were sermons warning against drunkenness, gambling, and inappropriate behavior. Some clergy tried to emphasize solemnity and restraint. But the season resisted simplification. People expected Christmas to feel different. They wanted it to interrupt routine. They wanted noise, food, and company. As a result, Christmas became increasingly associated with abundance. Decorations remained modest. Evergreen branches were used occasionally, but mostly indoors and without ceremony. Candles were practical. There were no trees as we recognize them today. Gift-giving existed, but it was limited. Small tokens were exchanged, often symbolic or useful. Large personal gifts were uncommon. The emphasis was on shared experience, not individual exchange. Over time, local customs developed. Each region added its own details. Some emphasized certain saints. Others focused on communal meals. Some extended the season longer than others. There was no universal Christmas experience. This lack of uniformity was normal. Medieval life was fragmented. Travel was difficult. Communication was slow. Traditions evolved locally and spread unevenly. Despite this variation, certain themes remained consistent. Christmas was a pause. It was communal. It involved food, light, and gathering. It was also expensive. Hosting feasts strained resources. Providing hospitality was expected even when supplies were limited. For poorer households, Christmas could be stressful rather than joyful. Still, the expectation persisted. Over centuries, Christmas became deeply embedded in social life. It marked the end of one year and the beginning of another. Contracts were renewed. Debts were acknowledged. Social ties were reinforced. It was not just a celebration. It was a checkpoint. This visibility made Christmas vulnerable to criticism. As religious reform movements emerged, particularly those emphasizing simplicity and discipline, Christmas came under scrutiny. It was loud. It was indulgent. It blurred boundaries. To some, it looked suspiciously like the older pagan festivals it had replaced. These criticisms would eventually grow stronger, leading to periods where Christmas was restricted, discouraged, or even banned entirely. But in the medieval world, those conflicts were still ahead. For now, Christmas was secure. It was familiar. It was expected. People did not analyze it deeply. They participated because that was what the season required. Year after year, the behaviors repeated. Feasts were hosted. Candles were lit. Songs were sung. Work paused. And repetition did what it always does. It made Christmas feel ancient. By the time the medieval period drew toward its end, Christmas no longer felt like a borrowed festival or a recent invention. It felt inevitable, as though it had always existed in this form. Few people questioned where its customs came from. They were simply part of winter now. In the next part, we'll move into a time when this familiar season suddenly became controversial, when certain groups decided that Christmas had gone too far and attempted to remove it entirely from public life. For now, there's nothing you need to hold on to. The feast is over. The candles burn low, and the season rests, waiting for its next transformation. As Christmas became more established, it also became more visible. And visibility often invites criticism. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was changing. Religious reform movements questioned long-held practices. Authority was challenged. Traditions were examined closely, sometimes aggressively. Christmas did not escape this attention. To some reformers, the holiday had become excessive. It involved feasting, drinking, games, and behavior that felt uncontrolled. The religious meaning, they argued, had been buried under indulgence and habit. Christmas, in their view, looked less like worship and more like distraction. In England, Puritan groups were particularly uncomfortable with the season. They believed religious observance should be simple, focused, and free from unnecessary ceremony. Christmas, with its noise and social pressure, did not fit that vision. They pointed out that the Bible did not command the celebration of Jesus' birth. They noted that December 25th had no clear scriptural basis. They criticized the way people treated the holiday as an excuse for excess. To them, Christmas was not sacred. It was suspicious. As Puritan influence grew, so did resistance to Christmas. Sermons were preached against it. Pamphlets were written condemning it. Some communities attempted to ignore it entirely. Then, in the mid-17th century, criticism turned into action. During the English Civil War and the years that followed, the Puritan-led government officially banned Christmas celebrations. Shops were ordered to remain open on December 25th. Decorations were discouraged. Public festivities were restricted. This was not symbolic. It was enforced. The goal was not to ruin winter. It was to remove what reformers saw as an unbiblical tradition that encouraged disorder. Christmas, they argued, was a human invention, and human inventions could be undone. The response from the public was mixed. Some people complied quietly. Others were confused. Many were unhappy. Christmas had been part of winter life for generations. Removing it did not remove winter itself. People still expected rest, food, and gathering. In some places, people celebrated anyway, quietly, indoors, away from officials. In others, tensions rose. There were reports of protests, arguments, and even small riots over the right to celebrate Christmas. This resistance revealed something important. By this point, Christmas was no longer just a religious observance. It was a social expectation, a seasonal rhythm, a shared pause in the year. Banning it felt like removing a familiar landmark. Similar debates occurred elsewhere. In parts of colonial America, particularly in Puritan-influenced regions like Massachusetts, Christmas was also discouraged or outlawed. For a time, celebrating it could result in fines. Once again, the reasoning was theological. The holiday lacked biblical authority. It encouraged idleness. It resembled pagan festivals too closely. And once again, the public response varied. Some communities ignored Christmas entirely for decades. Others observed it quietly. Over time, enforcement weakened. Eventually, the bans faded. In England, the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 brought Christmas back into public life. Decorations returned. Feasts resumed. The holiday reasserted itself. But it did not return unchanged. The conflict had left its mark. Christmas became more restrained in some places. Certain excesses faded. The tone softened slightly. It remained social, but less chaotic. In other regions, especially where Christmas had never fully disappeared, traditions continued much as before. This uneven history explains why Christmas customs differ so widely across cultures today. Some emphasize quiet family gatherings. Others emphasize public celebration. Some focus on religious meaning. Others barely mention it at all. All of these approaches are historically consistent. Christmas has always been flexible. What the attempts to ban Christmas revealed most clearly was not its weakness, but its resilience. Even when officially discouraged, people found ways to preserve parts of it. They kept the meals. They kept the gatherings. They kept the sense that winter required something extra. Traditions survived not because they were enforced, but because they were useful. By the 18th century, Christmas existed in a quieter form in many places. It was no longer a grand public festival everywhere, but it had not disappeared. It was waiting. The world was changing again. Industrialization was beginning. Cities were growing. Family structures were shifting. Work patterns were becoming more rigid. And in this new environment, Christmas would take on a different role. One that emphasized home, emotion, and memory. But that transformation had not yet arrived. For now, Christmas had survived opposition, regulation, and skepticism. It had been challenged, restricted, and debated. And still it remained. Because winter still arrived. Darkness still gathered. And people still wanted something familiar to hold on to. In the next part, we'll drift into the 19th century, where Christmas would be reshaped once more, becoming softer, warmer, and far more sentimental than it had ever been before. For now, you can let the arguments fade. The pamphlets can be put away. The noise of disagreement can quiet down. Winter continues, regardless. And Christmas, patient as ever, waits for its next reinvention. By the early 19th century, life in many parts of the world was changing rapidly. Work was becoming more structured. Time was measured more strictly. Cities grew larger, louder, and more crowded. For many people, daily life began to feel less seasonal and more mechanical. In this environment, Christmas began to shift again. It softened. It moved inward. Where earlier versions of Christmas had been public and communal, the 19th century began to reshape it into something quieter and more domestic. The focus turned toward the home, the family, and the idea of togetherness. This change did not happen all at once. It emerged gradually, shaped by literature, social reform, and nostalgia for a simpler past that may never have existed. One of the most influential forces in this transformation was storytelling. Writers began to use Christmas as a setting for moral reflection. The season became a time when characters reconsidered their choices, reconciled with others, and expressed generosity. These stories did not invent Christmas, but they reframed it. Perhaps the most famous example is a short novel published in 1843. It told the story of a man who disliked Christmas and was persuaded, over the course of a single night, to change his ways. The book was widely read. It was performed aloud. It was adapted for the stage. Its themes spread quickly. The message was simple. Christmas was a time for kindness, charity, and emotional openness. This idea resonated. Industrial life had created distance. Long work hours separated families. Urban poverty was visible and uncomfortable. Christmas stories offered a moment of pause, a reminder that generosity and compassion were still possible. Gradually, these values became associated with the holiday itself. Christmas was no longer about public feasting or social inversion. It was about warmth, empathy, and shared feeling. Decorations followed this shift. Homes became the center of celebration. Candles, greenery, and handmade ornaments were used to create atmosphere. The goal was not display, but comfort. Gift-giving changed as well. Instead of small symbolic tokens exchanged between adults, gifts became expressions of affection, especially for children. Toys, books, and simple pleasures took on greater importance. This focus on childhood was new. Earlier forms of Christmas had involved children only incidentally. Now, they were central. Christmas became a time of wonder, anticipation, and memory. This emphasis helped anchor the holiday emotionally. Adults remembered their own childhoods. Traditions became tied to personal experience rather than public obligation. At the same time, Christmas became more standardized. Printed materials spread ideas quickly. Songs, stories, and images circulated widely. People who had never met shared similar expectations of what Christmas should look and feel like. This did not erase regional variation, but it reduced it. Christmas became recognizable. It had a mood. It had imagery. It had an emotional script. Even religious observance shifted slightly. Church services remained important, but the emphasis moved toward reflection rather than authority. Charity became a key theme. Organizations used the season to encourage giving. Public campaigns highlighted need and generosity. Once again, Christmas adapted to its surroundings. In a world that felt increasingly impersonal, it offered intimacy. In a time of rapid change, it offered continuity. By the end of the 19th century, many of the features we now associate with Christmas were firmly in place. Family gatherings, warm decorations, gift-giving focused on children, emotional storytelling. What remained was to solidify the visual symbols. Trees, lights, and familiar figures would soon become unavoidable. But at this stage, Christmas was already emotionally complete. It no longer needed to justify itself through theology or authority. It justified itself through feeling. People celebrated Christmas not because they were told to, but because it matched something they wanted to believe about themselves. That they were kind, that they valued togetherness, that they remembered what mattered. This version of Christmas proved powerful. It survived further industrialization. It crossed borders. It adapted to different cultures. And it prepared the holiday for its final transformation into a global, highly recognizable season. In the next part, we'll slow down even further and focus on one of the most recognizable symbols of modern Christmas. A symbol that began quietly, regionally, and without much ceremony, before eventually moving indoors and becoming almost impossible to ignore. For now, you can rest with this softer version of the season, one built on stories rather than rules, on feeling rather than obligation. The city can quiet down, the lights can dim slightly, and Christmas, newly reshaped, settles comfortably into the home. At some point in the 19th century, a tree moved indoors and quietly changed Christmas forever. This did not happen all at once, and it did not happen everywhere. There was no announcement, no official approval, just a gradual spread of a practice that felt pleasant enough to keep. The custom of decorating trees during winter had existed for a long time in parts of Europe, particularly in German-speaking regions. Evergreen trees were associated with endurance and continuity. They stayed green when everything else did not. Originally, these trees were often decorated outdoors or placed in public spaces. Branches were hung with simple ornaments. Apples, nuts, paper shapes, and candles were common. The decorations were modest. The effect was gentle. Bringing the tree inside was a practical decision. It allowed families to enjoy it for longer. It kept candles protected from wind. It created a focal point in the home during a season that was otherwise dark and repetitive. As the practice spread, the tree became associated specifically with Christmas rather than winter more broadly. Royal households helped popularize the image. When prominent families displayed Christmas trees publicly, illustrations circulated. People copied what they saw. The tree was visually appealing. It was adaptable, and it fit perfectly with the new domestic focus of the holiday. Decorating the tree became a ritual. Ornaments were added slowly, often reused year after year. Each one gained quiet significance through repetition. Candles were attached carefully. Fires were a risk, but the light was considered worth it. Later, safer alternatives would appear, but the idea of light on branches remained essential. The tree was not symbolic in any complex way. It was reassuring. It brought greenery indoors. It gave shape to the room. It made winter feel intentional. Other decorations followed. Wreaths, garlands, and greenery were arranged to soften interiors. They were not meant to impress. They were meant to create atmosphere. Lights multiplied. As technology advanced, candles gave way to oil lamps, then to electric lights. This allowed decoration to become safer and more elaborate. Homes glowed softly from windows. Streets reflected the change. Light had come full circle. Once a practical necessity, it was now decorative. It still pushed back the darkness, but in a quieter, more controlled way. Christmas decorations spread unevenly. Some households embraced them immediately. Others adopted them slowly. Some avoided them entirely. But over time, they became expected. The tree, in particular, became central. It provided a place for gifts. It created a sense of anticipation. It marked the space as different from the rest of the year. Children were often the most enthusiastic participants. Decorating the tree became part of the season's rhythm. Ornaments were handled carefully. Candles were watched closely. This ritual added another layer to Christmas. It created moments, small tasks that carried emotional weight. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Christmas tree had spread far beyond its regional origins. It crossed borders. It adapted to different cultures. Its meaning remained flexible. For some, it was religious. For others, it was purely decorative. For many, it was simply tradition. That flexibility ensured its survival. As Christmas became more commercialized, decorations expanded further. Ornaments became mass-produced. Styles changed. Trends emerged. But the basic shape remained the same. A tree, light, greenery, gathering. These elements echoed ancient responses to winter, even as they took on modern forms. Decorations did not create Christmas. They responded to it. They made the season visible. They also made it predictable. Seeing lights appear in familiar places signaled that the year was turning. That time was moving forward as expected. That winter had reached its familiar midpoint. In a world that changed rapidly, this predictability mattered. Christmas decorations became less about belief and more about reassurance. They told people that this season had arrived again, that it would pass again, that the rhythm continued. And like so many Christmas traditions, they did not require explanation to be meaningful. They simply needed to be repeated. In the next part, we'll turn to a figure who gradually took up residence in this decorated landscape. A character who began as a saint, changed through folklore, and eventually became one of the most recognizable figures in modern culture. For now, the tree can remain quietly lit. The ornaments can rest where they've been placed, and the season, softly illuminated, waits. Long before he wore a red suit or delivered presents in a single night, Santa Claus existed as a much quieter figure. His earliest form was a historical person, a bishop who lived in the 4th century in a region that is now part of modern-day Turkey. He was known for generosity, particularly toward the poor and toward children. Stories about him spread slowly. They were told locally at first, passed from one community to another. Over time, these stories grew. Details were added. Deeds became more impressive with repetition. This figure became known as Saint Nicholas. His feast day was celebrated in early December, not at the end of the month. In some regions, children received small gifts in his honor. These were symbolic acts, meant to encourage kindness and good behavior. Saint Nicholas was not connected to Christmas originally. His stories existed alongside other winter customs, separate and distinct. As traditions traveled, names changed. In parts of Europe, Saint Nicholas became Sinterklaas. In others, he blended with local folklore figures. He took on regional characteristics, sometimes benevolent, sometimes stern. These variations coexisted. There was no single version. When European settlers traveled to North America, they brought these stories with them. Over time, different traditions blended together. In the 19th century, writers and illustrators began to standardize the figure. Poems described him arriving by sleigh. Illustrations gave him a physical form. He became rounder, older, and more cheerful. These descriptions spread quickly through print. People recognized the image and repeated it. Gradually, Santa became associated specifically with Christmas rather than with a separate feast day. Gift-giving shifted toward December 25th. Children began to expect presents on that day. This change aligned with the growing focus on family and childhood. Santa fit perfectly. He rewarded good behavior. He visited quietly. He belonged to the home rather than the church. As advertising and mass media expanded, Santa's image became more consistent. Clothing settled into familiar colors. His personality became predictable. He was kind. He was patient. He was endlessly generous. This predictability made him useful. Santa became a way to explain traditions. He made gift-giving feel magical. He turned routine exchanges into stories. He also made Christmas appealing beyond religious boundaries. Santa did not require belief. He required participation. People could enjoy the season without committing to theology. This made Santa especially adaptable. As Christmas spread globally, Santa traveled with it. His image adjusted slightly from place to place, but the core remained the same. He was expected. He was familiar. He arrived every year. Santa did not replace religious meaning for everyone. For some, he existed alongside it. For others, he became the central figure of the season. Both approaches were acceptable. Like many Christmas traditions, Santa succeeded because he was flexible. He absorbed older stories. He adapted to new cultures. He changed with technology. Sleighs became symbolic rather than practical. Chimneys remained, even where they made little sense. The story continued because it was comforting. Santa represented abundance without obligation. He gave without requiring repayment. He arrived without disruption. He left quietly. In this way, he mirrored the idealized version of Christmas itself. By the 20th century, Santa was firmly embedded in the season. He appeared in stores, in movies, in songs. His presence signaled that Christmas had arrived. Children learned to recognize him before they understood dates or calendars. Adults accepted him because he made the season easier. He provided structure. He created anticipation. He also softened the commercial aspects of Christmas. Purchases became gifts. Transactions became surprises. Santa made repetition feel special. Each year followed the same pattern. Decorations appeared. Stories were told. Gifts were exchanged. And Santa returned, unchanged. This reliability mattered. In a world that moved quickly, Santa stayed the same. He became part of the background of winter. Not questioned, not analyzed, simply expected. In the next part, we'll step into the present and consider how Christmas functions today. As a global season, a cultural event, a flexible tradition that means different things to different people. For now, Santa can finish his quiet preparations. The sleigh can wait patiently, and the story, familiar and well-worn, settles gently into place. Today, Christmas exists in many forms at once. It is a religious observance for some, a cultural tradition for others, and for many, it is simply a familiar season that arrives every year, whether they ask for it or not. This layered nature is not accidental. It is the result of centuries of adaptation. Modern Christmas does not demand a single interpretation. It allows people to participate selectively. Some attend religious services. Some exchange gifts. Some decorate. Some do none of these and still feel the season arrive. The holiday has become flexible enough to fit into many lives. This flexibility has allowed Christmas to spread far beyond its original cultural and religious boundaries. It is observed in places where Christianity is not dominant. It appears in countries with different histories, climates, and traditions. In these places, Christmas often changes slightly. Foods are adjusted. Music is adapted. Customs blend with local practices. But the core remains recognizable. There are lights. There is gathering. There is a pause in routine. Christmas has become a marker of time more than a statement of belief. In modern life, time often feels continuous. Days blur together. Work follows people home. Seasons lose some of their meaning. Christmas interrupts this flow. It insists on being noticed. Even if someone chooses not to celebrate it, they are aware of it. Stores change. Music shifts. Public spaces transform. This visibility creates a shared experience. People may disagree about what Christmas should mean, but they recognize when it has arrived. Commercialization has played a large role in shaping modern Christmas. Gift giving has expanded. Advertising has grown louder. The season often begins earlier each year. This expansion has drawn criticism. Some feel that meaning has been lost. Others feel overwhelmed by expectation. The quiet parts of the season can be difficult to find. And yet, the core persists. People still gather. They still share food. They still mark the time. Many modern Christmas traditions are chosen rather than inherited. People decide which parts matter to them. Some focus on rest. Some focus on generosity. Some focus on connection. This choice reflects the holiday's long history of adaptation. Christmas has never been fixed. It has always absorbed what people needed it to be. In times of uncertainty, it offered reassurance. In times of abundance, it offered generosity. In times of isolation, it offered togetherness. It continues to do so, even as circumstances change. For some, Christmas is deeply meaningful. For others, it is simply familiar. For many, it is a mixture of both. None of these approaches are new. Throughout its history, Christmas has meant different things to different people at the same time. That may be its most consistent feature. When winter arrives, people still look for light. They still seek warmth. They still value moments of pause. Christmas provides a framework for these needs. Not because it is perfect, but because it is available. It arrives every year. It asks little. It adapts easily. And when it ends, life continues. The decorations are stored. The routines return. The season fades into memory. But the structure remains, waiting. When winter comes again, the habits will return. The lights will appear. The gatherings will happen. And Christmas, in whatever form it takes, will be there. You do not need to decide what it means. You do not need to participate in every tradition. You can take from it what feels useful and leave the rest behind. That, too, is part of its history. For now, the season can rest. The year can continue its quiet turn. And you can let these long, ordinary stories drift away, one by one, as the night settles comfortably around you. Thank you for listening. And as always, sleep well.